So hello everybody again and welcome to the 14th ReCap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Reconciling Democracy and Capitalism, the Return of the Great Challenge. Our speaker is Sheri Berman, a professor of political science from Barnard College, Columbia University. Sheri's research interests include European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism and fascism, and the history of the left. She has written about these topics for various scholarly and non-scholarly publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and Vox. She currently serves on the Journal of Democracy, Dissent, and Political Science quarterly boards. Her most recent book, Democracy and Dictatorship, From the Ancien Regime to the Present Day, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Sheri is a fellow of the American Political Science Association and the chair member of the Council on European Studies. Today's webinar is about how to reform capitalism to make it compatible with other social and political goals. Only because of the relative prosperity and stability of the decades after World War II, Americans and Europeans have forgotten how disruptive capitalism can be. The class conflict, extremism, and failed democratic experiments that plagued Europe up through the Second World War confirmed the belief that capitalism and democracy could not be reconciled. Yet after 1945, a social democratic understanding of the relationship between the two allowed for their reconciliation. Sheri will tell us about the intellectual and political development of this social democratic understanding to provide perspectives on the challenges and potential solutions facing Western societies today. Without further ado, Sheri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here in this seminar, following a bunch of great speakers who have also broadly addressed this topic. So since you're all here, you know that the title or the theme of this seminar is Rethinking Capitalism. And the goal of the seminar, as I understand it, is to provide an opportunity to reflect on the failures of our economic model, that is to say capitalism, and to think about the kinds of policies that might help to correct some of these failures or downsides. And it's certainly the case that capitalism's downsides and failures have become ever clearer over the past decades. Western growth levels during the late 20th and early 21st century were less than stellar. Its gains became much more unevenly distributed. This is true both within countries, with growing divergence between more successful and less successful regions within countries, particularly, of course, with metropolitan areas becoming more dynamic and rural areas falling further behind. This is also true with regards to the citizens that compose Western societies, my own country, the United States, being an outlier or an extreme example in this regard. In the United States, income inequality reached its highest point since it was tracked by our Census Bureau in the last 10 years. The top 1% of Americans control more of the nation's wealth than the entire middle class. Also, as previous speakers in this series, Angus Deaton and Ann Case, have argued, in the United States in particular, our citizens have become not only more distant from each other as far as income and wealth is concerned, but those who are sort of at the bottom of the income and wealth distributions have also become more likely to lead shorter lives, to have physical and mental health problems, to fall prey to alcoholism and addiction, and to live in broken communities. And in Europe, one of your colleagues here, Italio Colantoni, along with his colleagues Rosario Crino and Laura Ogliari, have come to similar conclusions for Europe. That is to say that it's not just that inequality has increased, but all kinds of negative consequences have gone along, health consequences, psychological consequences have gone along with that growing inequality. And also accompanying this inequality, perhaps in some ways even more worrying, has been declining social mobility, right? Particularly in the US, the late economist Alan Kruger referred to this as the great Gatsby curve, right? That is to say, as inequality has gone up, social mobility has gone down. And the reason this is, of course, so worrying is that it threatens to turn those inequalities into permanent categories. That is to say, to turn society's haves and have-nots almost into castes, difficult to escape from. And in the West, of course, alongside these kinds of things has also come just generally rising insecurity, right? Globalization and technological change have made citizens more uncertain about their and their children's futures. And these consequences of contemporary capitalism have created deep social divisions and resentments, as well as general political dissatisfaction in Western societies. Now, these consequences, social, political, economic consequences of capitalism are extensive and disturbing, but they are not new. In fact, as the introduction to this talk pointed out, it's only because of the relative prosperity and stability of the second half of the 20th century that Americans and West Europeans have forgotten how very disruptive capitalism can be. In fact, during the 19th, throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was very commonly believed that capitalism and democracy could not, in fact, be reconciled, right? So on one side of the political spectrum, or rather liberals and conservatives, believe that these systems could not be reconciled because they believe that if you had full democracy, one person, one vote, that you would get tyranny of the majority. The masses would use their vote to overwhelm or overthrow capitalism and to threaten the rights of private property. Now, on the left, there was a similar belief, although from the opposite perspective, right? People on the left also believed that if everyone was given the right to vote, if poor and workers were given the right to vote, that they would indeed threaten capitalism. And it was also believed on the left that precisely because of that, the middle and upper classes would in fact never allow true democracy to occur, that they would, as one Swedish socialist put it, resort to bayonets rather than allow everyone to vote and thereby threaten their economic power and privileges. And indeed, up through the early 20th century, this general belief that democracy and capitalism could not be reconciled, or at least were in serious tension, seemed to be borne out by history. Class conflict, left and right-wing extremism were pervasive in Europe, and this kind of conflict and extremism helped undermine democracy up through the interwar years. Yet, during the 1930s in Scandinavia and in the United States, and after 1945 in the rest of the West, a great transformation occurred, stabilizing democracy and capitalism and enabling them to be reconciled. Now, one critical reason for this I'd like to argue today or talk about today was the triumph of a social democratic understanding of the relationship between democracy and capitalism. Social democracy is a variant of socialism. It's distinguished by a conviction that democracy makes it both possible and desirable to take advantage of capitalism's upsides while protecting against its downsides. Now, since we are, as this seminar evinces, again in a period where many people, or at least a growing number of people, have become aware of capitalism's downsides and how these downsides can undermine political and social stability, I think it's worth reviewing how and why this earlier transformation occurred. So I had a quote from Carl Sagan on that first slide about how important it is to learn from the past in order to better understand the challenges of the present. And so that's what I'd like to offer you today. And in order to do this, I'm going to ask you to indulge me in a little bit of history, in particular, a little bit of history about the backstory of socialism. So socialism as a political movement is inexorably tied up, of course, with the history of capitalism. In fact, capitalism is the reason why socialism first arose. When capitalism spread across Europe, across the West in the 19th century, it led to unprecedented growth and innovation, but at the same time also led to dramatic inequalities, social dislocation, and cultural upheaval. And not surprisingly, these latter qualities led quickly to a backlash against this new system. And during the last decades of the 19th century, Karl Marx emerged as capitalism's most powerful critic. Now, Marxism's power came from its ability to combine a scathing critique of capitalism's nature and consequences with a conviction that they would lead inevitably to capitalism's collapse, right? So, one great, summary of this was that, Marx believed that it was a question of laws, tendencies working with iron necessity towards inevitable results. Capitalism was inevitably doomed to collapse. But despite this conviction on Marx's part, this belief that capitalism would be transcendent just by virtue of its inherent dynamics, even after a long depression at the end of the 19th century, capitalism, in fact, showed no signs of collapse whatsoever. And so this raised the question of what was to be done. If capitalism wasn't going to disappear on its own, how should socialists bring about a better world? So some, like this fellow here, argued that if capitalism wasn't going to disappear on its own, socialists should eliminate it by force, right? This was the argument, this was the position that Lenin took to this question, and his heirs came to be known as communists. Most socialists, however, rejected the violence and the vanguardism of Lenin's view and remained committed to a peaceful path to socialism. But within this camp, the peaceful socialists, we had divisions as well. So some socialists believed that even though Marx might have been wrong about the imminence of capitalism's collapse, he was right that its immense negative consequences meant it could not and should not persist indefinitely. And from this perspective, reforms of capitalism, trying to improve it, trying to make it more humane, had limited value, since you couldn't fundamentally alter the nature of the system, right? So two people, well-known figures in this camp were Rosa Luxemburg, Jules Gide, who was a head of the French Socialist Party, many examples of this kind of view in Italy as well, right? The idea here being that any attempt to reform capitalism was useless. You couldn't fundamentally alter the nature of the system. You would just be sort of tinkering around the edges. Now, another faction within this peaceful camp, the people who would become the progenitors of social democracy, rejected this view. They rejected the view that capitalism was bound to collapse in the foreseeable future, and that rather than trying to transcend capitalism, to go beyond it, socialists should try to harness its immense productive capacity while ensuring that it worked towards progressive rather than destructive ends, right? The most famous exemplar of this view was a fellow named Edward Bernstein, who was a German politician and theorist. He did not, as this quote from him points out, believe that, again, capitalism was going to be collapsing anytime soon, and therefore it was unwise for socialists to base their tactics on the view that the better world would come by virtue of capitalism's collapse. His most famous comment was what is usually termed the final goal of socialism is nothing to me. The movement is everything. And by this, he merely meant that what socialists should be doing was actively working on a daily basis to create a better world, to put in place reforms that could cumulatively help workers and other victims of capitalism. The story of socialism during the late 19th and early 20th century is in fact a story of the battle between these alternatives, or among these alternatives: communism, democratic socialism, and social democracy. And this battle reached its crescendo during the interwar years in the West. And during this period, growing economic problems, which of course culminated in the Great Depression, exacerbated the social conflict in these societies and fed growing extremism, which of course eventually helped undermine democracy in many countries in Europe. So the question arose during the interwar period, in the hour of capitalism's greatest crisis, that is to say the Great Depression in particular: what should socialists do? Should they sit back and cheer, seeing these troubles as a sign that capitalism was in fact on the verge of collapse, like Marx had long promised? Or should they try to stem the bleeding and improve the system so that these kinds of disasters could never happen again? So for democratic socialists, the answer was to be passive. There was nothing that politicians and governments could fundamentally do to alter the dynamics of capitalism, right? So Rudolf Hilferding, great socialist economic theorist and one of the most important theorists within the German SPD during this time, claimed that, again, there was little point in an offensive or activist economic policy during the Great Depression because the driving force of history was the logic of capitalism. And to be clear, he and the German SPD were offered the kind of activist Keynesian policies that I'll talk about in a minute were adopted in places like Sweden and the United States, and he rejected them because he did not believe they could fundamentally work. One wonderful quote by Hilferding is that because Marxists like himself and classical liberals believed in the kind of, ineluctable, unalterable, nature of markets, that they could not and should not be interfered with, he claimed that orthodox Marxists were the last and best of the classical economists. During the Great Depression, communists, not surprisingly, were gleeful because they thought that this was the time when the democratic capitalist system surely would collapse. And so they eagerly awaited this collapse, and in many cases tried to help it along, even by allying with fascists and National Socialists to overthrow the democratic system so that the Great Depression could work. Its wonderful consequences in places like Germany, this alliance, again, really helped to further deepen the crisis of democracy. Now, social democrats, on the other hand, recognize the dangers for democracy and for the left of ignoring the suffering and the extremism generated by the Depression. And they argued during this time that the time had come for the left to commit to the primacy of politics. That is to say, to an activist response to the Depression, right? That it was time for social democrats to use political power to fundamentally change the nature of the system. They were against the inaction proposed by both their democratic socialist colleagues and by classical liberals of the time. Now, plans for an activist response to the Depression emerged in almost all European countries during this time, but it was only in Scandinavia, and in particularly in Sweden, where the social democratic view was able to dominate a party and therefore be able to be implemented as governing policy, right? So again, what's important to note here, right, is the activism and indeed the optimism of this view, right? The belief that not only should something be done, but that something could be done, that it was the job of democratic governments to protect citizens, to take control over economic developments where necessary in order to protect citizens and democracy from the negative consequences of capitalism. And so the Swedish SAP, which I don't have, unfortunately, time to talk more about, very much entered elections in the early 1930s with this kind of appeal, that it promised that if it came to power, it would respond to the Depression actively and in the interests not just of workers, but of society more generally, and that inaction was simply not an option. Of course, this type of approach was also taken up by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the United States. He reached many of the same conclusion as European social democrats did. Alongside Germany, of course, the United States was hardest hit economically by the Great Depression. And although democracy was obviously much more strongly rooted in the US than it was in Europe, during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the number of disaffected American citizens grew, racist and populist movements also grew, and a number of prominent elites and politicians, Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, and others, openly praised Mussolini and Hitler. And Roosevelt recognized, precisely as his social democratic counterparts did, that if the Depression was not forcefully addressed, if he could not prove to citizens that democratic governments were willing and able to respond to their needs, that support for democracy would decline. So, one nice quote by a lawyer within the New Deal administration, also a socialist, Jerome Frank, during this time, we socialists are trying to save capitalism, and the damn capitalists won't let us, right? A classic, I would say, social democratic kind of quote. So Roosevelt, as I'm sure you're all aware, promised a new deal for the American people that would alleviate economic suffering, restore faith in both capitalism and democracy. So again, during the interwar period, this understanding of the need for democratic governments to work actively to fix capitalism's problems, to protect citizens from its negative consequences was adopted only really in Scandinavia and to a lesser degree in the United States. But by the end of the Second World War, there was relatively widespread agreement that the economic problems of the interwar years and the Great Depression had provided fertile ground for extremism, and it helped undermine democracy. And so when the dust clears after 1945, right, there is relatively widespread agreement across the political spectrum that finding a way to protect against capitalism's negative consequences is absolutely necessary if democracy is finally going to be able to work in Europe after the Second World War. Now, what's interesting is that this social democratic view of the relationship between democracy and capitalism becomes not just dominant on the left, crowding out or becoming, again, the dominant view over a democratic socialist or communist view within West European societies. It also comes to dominate, to some degree, other political parties as well, right? So if you look back, for instance, at the types of things that were said, the types of appeals that were made by center-right parties after the Second World War, there was very much this acceptance, right? That a new relationship had to emerge between governments and capitalism if democracy were to survive, if social stability were to be maintained after the Second World War. And even on the American side, right, where obviously this kind of social democratic consensus was somewhat attenuated, there was indeed among many of the architects of the post-war order this very clear understanding that one of the most important things that this post-war order needed to do was to figure out a way to protect against capitalism's negative consequences, that depressions and economic suffering were the source of extremism and therefore an immense problem for democratic stability during the post-war period, right? So here, Jacob Viner and Henry Morgenthau, sort of important architects and figures on the American side, playing a role in rethinking the rebuilding of European political economies after the Second World War. So after 1945, accordingly, as Western European nations began to rebuild their political economies, they were rebuilt on a new foundation, on the basis of a new understanding that while it was absolutely necessary to ensure economic reconstruction and economic growth, at the same time, equal efforts had to be made to protect citizens from capitalism's negative consequences. And it may be the case that even in Europe, a lot of people have forgotten how very dramatic this transformation was, right? So if you go back and you look at figures from the time who had lived through the interwar period and the transformation after 1945, there is a very clear recognition of how significantly political economies and thoughts about capitalism had changed, right? So Anthony Crosland, for instance, claimed that post-war economies were different in kind after 1945. It was increasingly regarded as a proper function, indeed obligation of government to ward off distress and strain, not only among the poor, but among all classes of society. T.H. Marshall, great theorist of the social contract, indeed argued that the kinds of orders that were put in place after 1945 represented a new type of social contract between the state and society, where the state was accepting to some degree the obligation of eliminating the kinds of inequalities and divisions that had plagued European societies in the past. Andrew Schoenfield, perhaps the foremost chronicler of post-war European capitalism in his book, Modern Capitalism, even questioned whether the post-war order and the social structure that went with it were so different from their pre-war predecessors that it was impossible to use the word capitalism to describe them. Now, of course, this was a little bit of hyperbole. Obviously, what you had in Europe after 1945 was indeed a capitalist order. But unlike what communists and democratic socialists had hoped, this was a capitalism tempered by actions of democratic governments. And this was also, of course, in opposition to what classical liberals would have preferred, which was, of course, not to have as much interference in capitalism as post-war European governments committed themselves to. Now, this post-war social democratic order worked remarkably well. As I'm sure everybody who's listening is aware, the 30 years after 1945 were Europe's fastest period of growth ever. And it wasn't just that economies grew rapidly, it was that the benefits of this economic growth were more evenly distributed than in the past. And politically, the consequences of this post-war order were perhaps in some ways even more dramatic. You got, after 1945, as I mentioned, for the first time in West European history, stable democracy as the norm. Not perfect democracy, but stable democracy. This was something that simply did not exist in Europe before the Second World War. There, of course, had been many democratic experiments, but the successful ones were the exception and not the norm. After 1945, democracy came to be taken for granted. Now, despite this remarkable success, after about 30 years, you began to see some decay in this order. Now, there's lots of reasons for this. The problems really seem to begin in the 1970s with some economic problems that Western societies began experiencing. And one thing these economic problems did was open up a space for attacks on this order by neoliberals who had long been dissatisfied with it, right? Classic quote by Milton Friedman, how it's the job of dissidents to sort of come up with good ideas, alternative worldviews, and just wait for the moment when history allowed them to be pushed successfully. So this begins in the 1970s, again, as economic problems begin to mount and some people begin to question the continued efficacy of this social democratic order. And of course, after 1989, when the Soviet Union collapses and eliminates the threat of communism, liberals, conservatives, and others long opposed to the social democratic order are emboldened to increase attacks by it. And generally what you get after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, is a kind of belief that capitalism and democracy are not just better than the alternative, right? But they are inherently, that they inherently go together, right? This is, of course, opposite of what had been previously believed. And so what we get by the end of the 20th century is in many ways a dramatic reversal of the post-war pattern, where, again, after the post-war, after the Second World War, we get a sort of social democratic consensus that spreads across the mainstream left and right. By the end of the 20th century, a neoliberal consensus had come to dominate as well. It dominates the economics profession, as many surveys of the literature and sort of comments make clear. And this neoliberal consensus also comes to dominate sort of the public intellectual debate on these kinds of topics as well. If you go back, for example, and look at comments by influential journalists and commentators of the time, late 20th century, there is again a general consensus that this neoliberal order represents the best of all worlds, that capitalism is stable, that we know how to make sure that problems never exist, that we don't need an activist state, that many of the policies that we had taken for granted, the rules, the regulations, the other kinds of things that had limited capitalism in the past were not only no longer necessary, but no longer even wise or good ideas. And this consensus, as I mentioned, spreads perhaps most surprisingly, not just across economics profession, public intellectuals, and much of the right, but even to the mainstream left as well, right? So this is the era, the late 20th century of, sort of Tony Blair's Labour Party, Gerhard Schroeder's SPD, Clinton's New Democrats, even the Swedish Social Democrats begin to shift towards a more neoliberal understanding of the economy, towards the center, so to speak, as far as economic policies are concerned, right? And again, reflecting this view that capitalism and democracy were no longer problematic, that they were sort of naturally kind of stable, and tensions within and between them were no longer really an issue. Again, going back to the time, we can see remarkable comments by even politicians on the left, ostensibly on the left, like Blair and Clinton, who agreed that the progressive parties of today were parties of fiscal responsibility and prudence, right? It was the job of governments to work with business, to create jobs, and that the old battles between state and market, these were a thing of the past, right? Labor's manifesto in 1997 kind of epitomizes this. We aim to put behind us the bitter political struggles of left and right that have torn our country apart for too many decades. Many of these conflicts have no relevance to the modern world. Public versus private, bosses versus workers, middle class versus working class. It's time for this country to move on and move forward. I mean, a remarkable shift in understandings of whether or not capitalism is problematic, whether or not it is destabilizing, whether or not it promotes, it potentially provides challenges for democracy and social stability. So the results of this shift from a social democratic to a neoliberal consensus were predictable, but unpredicted. The decline of the social democratic order brought a return of precisely the problems it had originally been put in place to address. Now, again, this seminar has addressed extensively many of the downsides of contemporary capitalism. I mentioned them briefly at the beginning: slower growth, rising inequality, rising insecurity, geographic and social divisions, right? I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to talk more about the political consequences of this shift, right? They may be a little bit less familiar to some of you. So the political consequences of this shift from a social democratic to a neoliberal consensus. So one obvious consequence of this shift was the decline of the center left, right? By the end of the 1990s, these social democratic parties, labor parties, center left parties in Europe and even in the United States, they had so watered down their economic profile that by any research, by any analysis, it's very clear if you look at these programs that they had shifted so much to the center that they had more in common now with their competitors on the center right than they did with, you know, their versions of themselves from the 50s and 60s. And this watering down of the distinctive profile of center left and social democratic parties made these parties less attractive to the voters who became fed up with the consequences of this neoliberal order, particularly after the fallout from the 2008 financial crisis, right? So especially after 2008, one thing that a lot of people remarked upon was how surprising it was that parties of the left didn't benefit from what was then seen as the greatest crisis of capitalism since the late 20th century, right? But this shouldn't have been surprising because these parties no longer represented the foremost critics of capitalism. They no longer presented themselves, as those previous slides made clear, as the parties who were conscious of capitalism's downsides, who were committed to fighting against them, and in particular to protecting those people who were most vulnerable to the consequences of capitalism. Another consequence, political consequence of this shift from a social democratic to a neoliberal consensus, right? As these social democratic parties, parties of the center left, watered down their traditional economic profile, they opened up a political space for an economic shift by the populist right. Now, it's important to remember that most of the populist right, not all of these populist right, but most of the parties that exist today in Europe have their roots in populist, right-wing populist movements that arose during the late 20th century. But when these populist movements, right-wing populist movements, started to appear in the late 20th century, they initially were almost all liberal or conservative in their economic policy profiles, right? So the National Front, perhaps the oldest, most important populist, right-wing populist party in Europe, right? When it began, originated in the late 20th century, ruled by or led by Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of the current leader, right? Proudly proclaimed that he had adopted the principles of Reaganomics and Thatcherism before they became fashionable. But of course, as we know now, that party no longer has that profile at all. It is very much shifted to a welfare chauvinist, perverse version of that social democratic profile. Same thing happened with other populist parties, right? That started off with neoliberal or conservative economic profiles, but as social democratic parties shifted to the center, almost all of these parties shifted also in their economic profiles, right? To capture the space that had been left behind by social democratic parties. Furthermore, political consequence of this social democratic shift, from a social democratic to a neoliberal consensus. So as convergence happens on the center on economic policy, as the center left and the center right become less distinctive with regards to the economic options that they are offering to voters, what we get is the growing salience of non-economic issues, socio-cultural issues. As again, mainstream parties could not distinguish themselves anymore economically, we see growing emphasis on non-economic issues, right? So what we see during the late 20th and particularly early 21st century, if you look at party programs, if you look at newspaper articles, if you look at the statements of politicians, it's not that economic issues disappear, but growing emphasis on, growing importance of, growing prominence of non-economic issues during this time: national identity, immigration, national traditions, yada, yada, yada. And it's not just that parties and politicians begin shifting what they emphasize, right? Many social scientists, political scientists, and economists find, right, that as the downsides of neoliberalism become clearer, as the negative consequences of contemporary capitalism became clearer, that in and of itself, those negative economic conditions themselves help to increase the salience of socio-cultural issues. So political scientists consistently find, again, this is fairly intuitive, right, that things like xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, the resentment of outgroups, et cetera, tend to rise during difficult economic times, times when citizens worry about things like their jobs, their job prospects for themselves and their children, when they're concerned about competition for scarce resources. And economists have found the same kind of thing, right? So in the United States, famously, David Autor and his fellow authors, right? And in Europe, similar kinds of things, again, with your colleague Calantoni, found again that during times when the negative consequences of contemporary capitalism were become clearer, that these kinds of difficult economic times tend to raise the salience of these socio-cultural issues. And when these kinds of issues come to the forefront of the political agenda, that is to say, these non-economic socio-cultural issues, it's the populist right that benefits. These kinds of issues do not help the center left. They do not help social democratic parties. They are a boon for the populist right. So this is, again, following those political consequences down the line. Low income, low education voters, these kinds of folks have always been relatively conservative on these socio-cultural issues, but left-wing on their economic issues. Now, as long as during the post-war period, center-left social democratic parties offered a distinctively left-wing economic program and class-based appeals, and socio-cultural issues were not prominent parts of the political debate, you got low-income, low-education voters disproportionately voting for the left. But as this changed during the late 19th and 20th century, as the left became less distinctively left on economic issues, as the populist right moved to this welfare chauvinist position, and as these trends came together to increase the salience of sociocultural issues, right, you increasingly got low education, low income voters becoming a prominent part of the support base for the populist right. So again, just findings more generally to back this up, how these voters who, again, during a previous generation would have been, main parts of the voting bloc for the center left and for other mainstream parties, increasingly these type of voters shifting into the camp of the populist right, as this shift to a neoliberal consensus really created a variety of political consequences that freed them to be captured by these new illiberal and even anti-democratic movements. And so in many places, in many European countries, right-wing populist parties now, perhaps most notably in France and Austria, these are largely parties, again, of the working classes, of the low education voters. And this is also, of course, true in the United States, albeit it takes on a somewhat different form because we have a two-party system. And so that right-wing populist party is ensconced within the Republican Party, and those voters have accordingly become a core constituency of the Republican Party. And this is, again, particularly associated, it didn't start at all with Trump, it was just accelerated or affirmed by him, linking these voters to the Republican Party, particularly on the basis of these socio-cultural appeals and the perception that the Democratic Party, of course, is out of touch with these voters, no longer representing them either from an economic or from a socio-cultural perspective. So again, political consequence of all of these things, decline of the center left, rise of the populist right, and in particular, again, a shift on the part of capitalism's, the folks who lose out from capitalism, the people who would have, during the post-war period, voted for the center left, have now increasingly become the voters of the populist right. There's a sort of, there was a very nice essay written some years ago by a French playwright and intellectual who sort of talking about his pain at watching this kind of shift happen within his own family, and in particular with his father, how he shifted from being, in the French context, a supporter of the Communist Party to a supporter of the National Front, right? Because his father, as he put it, had felt abandoned by the political left during the late 20th century, when it began adopting the language and thinking of the free market, that shift to neoliberalism. It stopped speaking about things like social class, injustice, poverty, suffering, pain. My father would complain, he said, that left, right, now they're all the same, and that whatever distilled for him the disappointment in those who, in his mind, should have been standing up for him but were not. That was the historical role, of course, of the left. By contrast, the National Front, right-wing populists, railed against poor working conditions and unemployment, laying all of the blame on immigration or the European Union. In the absence of any attempt by the left to discuss his suffering, his father latched on to the false explanations offered by the far right. Voting for him was a desperate attempt to exist in the eyes of others. All right, so again, political consequences of this shift to neoliberalism, declining support for center left, rising support for extremist parties, particularly right-wing populist parties. Also, we've seen another political consequence, a return more generally of this kind of assertion that democracy and capitalism are not compatible. The assertion, as I mentioned, that had been quite commonplace up through the early 20th century disappeared to a large degree after 1945, precisely as we would predict, has returned on both sides of the political spectrum as capitalism's negative consequences have become extremely clear, or have become clearer, right? So on the left, we increasingly see these kinds of arguments. Wolfgang Streck, who I think is probably the most forceful advocate of this view on the left, writing over the last 10 years in precisely the same vein as his late 19th and early 20th century predecessors, that there is inherent conflict between democracy and capitalism. It's a fantasy, a utopian fantasy, to believe that they can be reconciled. Now, on the right, we don't see as clear an assertion as we would have up through the interwar years of this belief that democracy should be overthrown to protect capitalism and private property. But we do see a significant inching in that direction. Increasing numbers in the United States, in particular, of books published by folks on the right about the inherent problems of democracy. And of course, a willingness, particularly during the Trump years and now after, as the Republican Party has increasingly moved into that populist right-wing camp, of folks willing to support Trump or the Republican Party simply because they see the left as being too dangerous to capitalism, to economic freedom, and all of these kinds of things. All right, so let me just sum up a little bit then, since I'm more than out of time. Anyone interested in defending capitalism and democracy should recognize that they are not naturally compatible, that there are tensions that exist between them. It took the tragedies of the interwar years and the Great Depression and the Second World War to make people on both sides of the Atlantic realize this, to recognize that if democracy and capitalism were to be made compatible, that a social democratic type of political economy would be necessary. An economy, a social democratic economy, meaning one where capitalism's upsides were recognized and respected, that is to say, the ability to produce growth, innovation, but also its downsides were recognized and to some degree respected, insofar as there was a clear understanding that left alone, capitalism could produce crises, inequality, insecurity, and other negative consequences, and that these negative consequences would threaten social stability and democracy. So again, here is a nice quote by Keynes, although not himself a social democrat, very much in the camp of understanding the types of problems and tensions that could exist between capitalism and democracy, right? And looking back at this period, the interwar period, recognizing that if there was a lesson to be learned from it, from depression, fascism, and war, it was this, that uncertainty elevated to the level of insecurity and collective fear was the corrosive force that had threatened and might again threaten the liberal world. By the end of the 20th century, after decades of stability, after the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, too many people had come to take capitalism, the stability of capitalism and democracy for granted. They had become complacent about the destructive tendencies of the former, capitalism, and about the fragility of the latter, democracy. As a result, over the past decades, innumerable policies that have increased insecurity and inequality and deepened social divisions have been allowed to progress. Anyone who understands the lessons of the past should not be surprised that such policies and such conditions have led to growing dissatisfaction with democracy, rising support for anti-establishment and even extremist parties. Now, as this seminar makes clear, some people at least have become increasingly aware of these problems, of these negative consequences of capitalism, of the fragility of the democracy, and of the need to come up with new policies capable of reforming the former so as to protect the latter. But this growing awareness has not yet translated into a systemic effort to recalibrate Western political economies along social democratic lines. That is to say, to find a new set of policies capable of correcting capitalism's problems, insulating citizens from the negative consequences of capitalism. And if we don't come up with such policies, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to fight back against the social divisions and resentments currently roiling Western societies that are feeding extremism and thereby helping to weaken democracy. Thank you very much for listening.